Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We're pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, who is the advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a top overview of the events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat window to ask your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Afnaf, and good evening from Israel. Well, obviously, anyone who's been watching the news is going to understand why we're going to focus mostly on the situation in Gaza tonight. Really, it's the thing leading not just the international news, but also everything that's going on in Israel at the moment. There really is a conundrum in Israel at all levels, from the highest downwards, exactly what to do with Gaza on many different levels. First of all, it does seem as of now that while Hamas seem to be losing the battle, certainly on the actual military plane, they might still win the war. And what I mean by that is that over the last week, the intensive international pressure on Israel, and pretty much solely on Israel, is really doing exactly the opposite of what some of the better intentioned international figures are trying to do. And that is to try and end the war, or at least get to some sort of a ceasefire. Because what they're doing by placing pressure only on Israel is they are telling Hamas, again, those who have good intentions obviously don't want this to happen, but this is what's happening. They're telling Hamas that we will give you successes, achievements that you do not earn and certainly do not deserve, as long as you stay away from the negotiating table, because you have nothing to lose and only a lot to gain. We saw, first of all, the speech of Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who said this week that if Israel does not make concessions, if Israel does not halt the war, a Palestinian state will be recognized at the UN General Assembly in September, when all leaders come to New York for the annual general meeting of world leaders. It's quite a remarkable statement, because it pretty much didn't ask anything from Hamas. Not that he really could, because he has no levers on Hamas. But what he did say implicitly, and again, taking him at his word, he claims to be some sort of friend of Israel. He wants the war to stop, as most people do of goodwill. But if you want the war to stop, at the moment, Israel is not the obstacle. Israel has already agreed to the proposal on the table, to the ceasefire proposal, and has made several compromises over the last few weeks. The deal is on the table. Hamas were getting closer and closer at one point, and when they started to see this international pressure ramp up, not only were they getting further away from the deal, they were actually outside the room. They basically gave up. They understood that international pressure will give them far more than any sort of negotiations will. So those around the world, including French President Emmanuel Macron, who this week held a meeting, or hosted a meeting with the Saudis at the UN, basically trying to drum up support for a Palestinian state, are also saying to Hamas, wait it out. You don't need to go back to the negotiating table. All of our blame, all of our attacks, all of our sanctions will be towards Israel, and there's no real need for you to come to the table. So as I said, Hamas sees this as a great win, sees absolutely no incentive to come to the negotiating table, and Israel is at quite a loss for this, because these demands basically put a ceasefire further away, and basically say to Hamas, as I've said, that they will achieve maximum success without compromise. If a Palestinian state is recognized en masse in September, it will be a great victory for Hamas, but as many will argue in Israel, it could be terrorism's greatest achievement in history, because October 7th will be seen by the terrorists, by Hamas and its supporters, as leading directly to the achievement of a internationally recognized Palestinian state. Now that is what Hamas are seeing, and that is why they are staying away from the table. And Israel can decide that it's going to meet all the demands and come to the table and agree to the ceasefire. But if the other side is not ceasing to fire, and the other side is not even at the table negotiating, then what really can Israel do? So Keir Starmer is not helping, and those like him, by basically laying all the blame and the possible actions at Israel's door, while basically not expecting anything from Hamas and taking an action, i.e. recognize a Palestinian state, that basically is more than Hamas could have hoped for, perhaps since October 8th onwards. So the furthest thing at the moment, the thing that's keeping a ceasefire, an end of the conflict, whatever resolution could come from this, is really those states who are basically chastising Israel and blaming Israel, threatening a Palestinian state, threatening sanctions, economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, business sanctions against Israel. And Hamas are sitting back and just lapping it up and are not getting anywhere close to the table. We don't just hear this from Israel, we hear this from the US, but even more so, we're hearing this also from the Egyptians, who are really getting fed up with Hamas and have broken off contacts for now. And even the Qataris, who are the closest in the international arena to Hamas, are getting extremely fed up with Hamas because they want an end to this conflict for their own interests. And Hamas, who they host and have funded for many years, are not even they're not even able to have too much pressure on them, because they are feeling pressure from the Americans chiefly to put pressure on Hamas. And Hamas are simply not interested. It doesn't seem at this point that anyone can put any sort of pressure on Hamas, because Hamas, again, and this is the bottom line, believe that they can gain more from being obstinate, being rejectionist, staying away from the negotiations, than anything that they could get during negotiations. All of this is really stumping a lot in Israel, a lot of people in Israel. In the US, we see Witkoff, the special envoy for the negotiations, coming to Israel tomorrow. He had a discussion with Egyptian senior officials tonight. They're trying to find some way around this obstacle, but also he's coming because of what we've certainly seen over the last week, the uptick in the coverage of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Now, I'm not going to get into whether there is a famine, starvation, etc. It's clear that the situation is not good, that there are people suffering. It's clear also that some of what is getting out is not entirely truthful. Let's not forget, and this is very important for everyone to understand, every single piece of information that comes out of Gaza, whether it's an image, a quote, a statistic, comes from Hamas. It either comes from an official Hamas resource or source, which is the Hamas Ministry of Health, that is specifically run by Hamas in every single way, or the images are from journalists who are either Hamas supporters or given permission to work by Hamas out of fear sometimes, or out of ideological support. So everything that comes out we have to take with a grain of salt, but it is clear, even from Israeli sources, that the situation is not good. We hear this from foes, but we also hear it from our closest friends. We also even heard it from President Trump, who said aboard Air Force One, I think it was today, that you'd have to be heartless not to have sympathy for these pictures that are coming out of Gaza, and they are heart-rendering. And he's right that anybody who sees these images, because not all of them are fake, some of the images are real, of course, and there is suffering. Israel has to take some responsibility, but the blame, as I said, going back to the first point, is almost non-existent from Hamas, which started this war, which sees a success in the suffering of their own people. It's part of their strategy from the very beginning. But Israel hasn't helped physically, it hasn't helped on the ground, and it hasn't helped in fighting back against this campaign, this narrative that has been there since the beginning of the war. I heard one commentator say today that even from October 2023, only days or weeks after the horrific October 7th massacre, we were already hearing the accusations that Gaza was starving, Gaza was on the edge of disaster. We've heard throughout the last 2 years some ridiculous and outrageous accusations, one from a UN, from OCHA, from the head of OCHA, which is the humanitarian wing of UN. At one point he said 14,000 children will die within the next 48 hours. Of course, that was absolutely absurd, and even the UN had to walk that back. But when for 2 years you've been hearing these accusations, starvation is going to happen, there's a famine, it's going to happen tomorrow, within the next month the whole of Gaza will not have enough food, and we've walked, all of those statements have been walked back within hours or days or weeks. It is a little bit of a situation of the boy that cried wolf, and a lot of Israelis didn't take these accusations seriously. Now, hopefully they are, taking them more seriously again, because the strategy has changed. Israel has changed its strategy on how much humanitarian aid can get in. It is, at this point, helping many nations airlift food in. It is allowing trucks, hundreds of trucks, many of the trucks that were left at the border over and in the Gaza side. One thing that Israel did well from a PR point of view is it did invite reporters into Gaza to see the hundreds of pallets of food that were just left there by aid organizations. It had already gone through security checkpoints on Israel's side. It was in Gaza. All it needed to do was being picked up. The international media did see this. Whether it was reported on, that's another question. But it's a very difficult situation for Israel as a democracy that has to check itself, has to check everything, to fight against what's becoming an obsession. There was a very interesting tidbit of information that former minister and former ambassador to the US and the UN, Gilad Erdan, said today, because there was quite a furore this week about the New York Times showing on its front page a heart-rendering image of a young child in mother's arms, bones coming through the skin, really, really terrible. And this was being framed as an example of the current starvation or famine in Israel. And now they had to walk it back thanks to Israeli intervention. The Israeli Consul General went to New York Times office and basically showed the reporters there proof that not only this particular child had pre-existing conditions, he had cerebral palsy and other things, he is currently undergoing treatment in Italy. So it was completely incorrect, the image. And so they wrote a very, very minor sort of correction that went out on a very small Twitter platform of a few thousand, whereas it's, on the front page of the newspaper and went out on the main New York Times Twitter platform that sees millions. It's a major problem. There is an obsession with Israel. There is an obsession with what Israel does far more than any other conflict, many of those with far greater casualties than we see in Gaza. And so just going back to what Gilad Erdan said, that he said when he was in New York, he asked for a meeting with the New York Times editors and showed them on many occasions where there's bias and where there's inaccuracies about Israel, and asked them straight out, why are you writing about Israel when you don't write about many other conflicts, you don't show good things about Israel, etc., etc. And he claimed that the response given was, that's what our readership expects. What else can you sort of say at this point? And it's not specific to the New York Times. It seems to be far wider if you look at the obsession on Israel. You have the UN Secretary General today or this week who basically said that this is the worst crisis for generations. Well, that's statistically simply not true. Even today, more people are starving and dying in wars in Sudan, in Yemen, have done so in the Syrian civil war up until recently, etc., etc. So even statistically, it's not true. But there seems to be an obsession with Israel. There seems to be an attempt always to paint Israel in the darkest brushes, in the darkest hues. And this is something which is very difficult to basically fight. I'm not letting our government off the hook. They can and should be doing more. But at this point in time, there seems to be a confusion. This doesn't seem to be a strategy exactly what's going to happen in Gaza, even on the ground militarily. At this point, again, we're hearing once again, we've heard this many, many times, that if Hamas do not come to the table, we're going to try something different. All hell will break loose. Now there's talk of annexing territory. If Hamas don't agree to a ceasefire, don't agree to release hostages, every day more and more territory will be annexed. I don't think it's a real threat. I think it's just another attempt to try and pressure Hamas to come back to the table. Will it be successful? I'm not so sure, because again, all they hear every single day is more and more international pressure on Israel. And they know that the international community, even led by President Trump, no longer has a stomach for it. So they know the longer this will go on, the more success and achievement they will gain. And this is the major problem as things stand. This is really at the crux of the suffering that we're seeing in Gaza, because if Hamas would agree to a ceasefire, then there'd be absolutely no limitations on aid. There would be no military operations, there'd be no fighting, there would be a ceasefire. So Israel is certainly not completely devolved of any responsibility, but really the international community, if it wants a ceasefire, if it wants an end to the suffering of the Palestinian people, it really has to do more to bring Hamas back to the negotiating table. So we'll see what Steve Witkoff will do when he comes to Israel tomorrow, and we'll see what steps are going to be taken in the coming days. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, many thanks, Ashley. I will begin with a question here from David Edmond, who asks, Israel is in a difficult predicament. Should Israel change its concept of victory and get the IDF out of harm's way and address the humanitarian crisis now, and then clean up the remainder of the Hamas mess later?
Well, this is something the opposition has been saying for quite a while. They're saying, go for ceasefire now, whatever it costs. Give Hamas whatever they want. Let's get the hostages back. And then in the future, Hamas will give us plenty of opportunities to re-attack. Whereas the critique of that is, first of all, many think really deep down, those involved, think that Hamas won't give up every single hostage, because they know exactly this. They also know that, they know that truth as well, that Israel can just go back to fighting them and destroying them, or whatever that can look like in the future. As someone said this week, you can't destroy Hamas. You can destroy it as a governing ability, you can destroy it as a functioning military, but as someone said, while there are two people in Gaza, probably one will support Hamas, according to all polls that we've seen. But again, Israel's aim is to stop it from functioning militarily and on a governance level. At the moment, it doesn't really seem to have a solution for that either, because what do you do the day after? Do you have a military occupation where Israeli soldiers are in charge of everything from sanitation to education to construction? Because you have to have someone to do that. The other alternative is bringing other nations in. Well, no nation's going to come in while Hamas is still there, or while the war is not completely over. So again, it's a little unclear. Israel has made a lot of steps towards some sort of compromise. I think we've spoken about it before, some sort of symbolic gestures, some Hamas leaders going abroad into exile, some sort of visuals on disarmament, but a complete destruction of Hamas, as I think the chief of staff said, will take many, many years, and maybe not even beyond that. So it's unclear exactly what the next steps are for Israel. Netanyahu has threatened to do something different. Trump has said maybe it's time for Israel to do something different. We're not quite sure what that is, but it does seem that there are discussions. But we've been hearing this for 2 years, that if Hamas don't do A, B, or C, then all hell break loose, or Israel do something different. And strategically, Tactically, yes, there have been changes, but strategically, nothing has really changed dramatically in recent months.
All right, thank you. Now, I'm going to a question here from Jack Kushner, who asks, well, Israel has already lost the PR war. President Trump said in Scotland that he knows what he would do. I too think Israel should go ahead and clear out central Gaza and begin annexation. What are your thoughts on that?
I didn't hear Trump. I heard Trump say the first part. He said, "I know what I would do," but then I think he followed it up with, "But I don't think anyone would really want to hear it." I didn't hear him say that he would annex central Gaza, but it does seem that there are some thoughts. Some interpretation would be a more militant approach, but then others could be a less militant approach. It's unclear exactly what President Trump would want to say, because maybe I missed something, but I heard him use the first phrase, "I know what I would do," but then I heard him follow up by saying, but I don't think that anyone really wants to hear it. I remember hearing him say that with representative of the EU who's in the White House. I didn't hear him say that while he was in Scotland, but it could be that I missed something.
All right, thank you. Now, Barack Korkmaz asks, what are the odds for a clash between Turkey and Israel slash South Cyprus slash Greece on northern Cyprus? Does Israel looking is Israel looking for a new front in the Mediterranean?
I didn't catch all of that, but Israel is not going to get involved with any foreign conflict, certainly not in Cyprus. Israel has no interests in what's going on in Cyprus. It has good relations with the Republic of Cyprus, but it's certainly not going to get involved with any sort of military. I don't even think that there will be any conflict there. Yes, there are disagreements, there's diplomatic disagreements. Certainly, the international community seems to be on the side of the Cypriot government and not with Ankara on that. But I don't see any conflict brewing. Again, I'm not an expert on what is going on in Cyprus, but I don't see a situation where there's a conflict, and certainly not where Israel would get involved militarily.
Right, thank you. Now, William asks, presumably with regards to the Palestinian territories, he asks, what is the government that the UK will recognize?
That's a very good question. Obviously, again, with these kind of declarations, they're always short on specifics. In fact, many in Israel have accused the UK and France of basically pandering to internal domestic considerations. If you look at the situation in France, I think I've mentioned this before, earlier in the year, there was a report by French intelligence that the Muslim Brotherhood has infiltrated many levels of French society, and one of its recommendations to prevent this or stem it is to recognize a Palestinian state, which is quite remarkable if they really believe that that would suddenly calm down militant Islamist organizations. But it is something which is bought hook, line, and sinker by many Western leaders and Western diplomats, that if you just, stand up for the Palestinians, then we'll have much less trouble with, radical Islamists in our country. What I'm sure the British government would say is they'll recognize the state of Palestine, and for them, the legitimate leadership is in Ramallah, is Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who's, what is he now? I think the joke is he's now 19 years into a 4-year term. An extremely corrupt and unpopular leader, someone who's maybe 1 inch more moderate than Hamas, certainly has not condemned the butchery to any decent level, still paying, funding terrorism, is still inciting against Israel and Jews in its textbook education, mosques and TV, whereas there's very little demands for any sort of reform or any cause of Mahmoud Abbas to do anything. but he seems to be maybe on the cusp of getting one of the biggest diplomatic victories by recognition of two, very large and important Western countries in the next few months. So it's quite an extraordinary thing, and it seems to be more about internal considerations, A, and B, about trying to punish or push Israel to where they want it. But it, as I said before, it's potentially, if there is some sort of mass recognition, it really will be one of possibly, and this is what some will argue in Israel, one of terrorism's greatest achievements.
All right, many thanks. Now, going to a question from Carrie Hillebrand, who asks, I know you've covered this in the past, but as Israel's global standing is in free fall, why is Israel's public diplomacy still largely MIA, and the little that there is amateurish and unconvincing?
There are many layers to this. We have dealt with this before, and it would take hours and hours to explain. I've been involved in the Israeli government for many years, been involved in many Hasbara attempts. As I said before, I'm not letting them off the hook. They can and should be doing more. There is a sort of feeling in Israel, if you have a certain policy, that speaks for itself. Israel is very slow to react. Israel is a democracy. The IDF always, when there's an accusation, says it will check on things. Don't forget, it's not easy to check on, for example, if someone shot this particular, you have to look for anyone who could have shot in a particular area. It's not just, you ask one person, did anyone shoot in that area? No, I don't think so. You have to ask, through various levels, and then you have to check exactly where it is, and then sometimes it's not even clear where it is and whatever. So it's not simple for a democracy, a liberal democracy, which actually has a rule of law, to check itself, whereas a terrorist organization can lie. What's the adage that a lie can fly halfway around the world before the truth is getting its shoes on? That's true of Israel. Israel does check itself. Israel doesn't lie. I'm not saying that they've never ever got anything wrong, but it never intentionally lies about something. But it really is fighting like it's fighting on the ground with one hand behind its back. There is an obsession with painting everything that Israel does. Just look at the language of any article or social media post or interview or influencer. The way Israel's case is being presented and the way the anti-Israel case is being presented. And also, let's be honest, an image, there are many fake images, as we said before, images taken out of context of suffering in Gaza, but there is suffering. And an image of suffering automatically creates sympathy. And around the world, it's very simple and easy to just say, well, it must be the country which is doing the attacking. Well, 2 years later, we're still fighting the war that began on October 7th, and we're trying to ensure that there isn't another October 7th because Hamas have promised to do so. The context is missing. Who started this war? Why is this war still going on? Who's refusing the ceasefire? Who's stealing the aid? Who's ensuring that aid doesn't go to the civilians? Who's ramping up the prices to make sure the average person can't get it? All of the answers to that is Hamas. Who gets the blame? Israel. There are many different, as I said to you before, the quote from Gilad Erdan, I could just go on and on and on. It's not to give our government a free pass. They can and should do a lot more. And everybody in Israel knows it, but very few are actually doing anything about it. But it's a really difficult situation. I looked the other day when foreign media was let into Gaza to see those hundreds of pallets of aid which had already passed through Israeli checks, and the only people who were reporting on it were Israeli reporters. I didn't see too much, if anything, of any international media picking up on that. And you had that picture, as I said, which was, in the end, it was taken completely out of context from a child that already suffered from many pre-existing severe conditions. But the damage has been done. That's not something Israel can do. Israel can't immediately just jump down, and it's if they're going to have a response, you see where the Israel response is, you see how it's coded, the language used. Also, you'll always find in Israel, a democracy, people are critical of Israel. So whereas you have two disgraced former Israeli prime ministers, Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert. One of them who is, was in prison for corruption, and another one who, I don't even want to go into it, who's basically everything they say makes the headline news. And they're very critical of Israel because they're very critical politically of Benjamin Netanyahu. And that's fine. But when these people are considered, experts and considered voices of Israel, then again, it's very difficult. Israel is a democracy. You have 10 million people living here, and you can always find a few people who will say, yes, Israel is doing genocide. Yes, Israel shoots children just for fun. You'll always be able to find some who want those headlines, who want to attack Israel. We had the other day, sorry, we're going over time, a member of the GHF who was fired after 100 days, apparently because of misconduct. And he basically went on the BBC and basically said that Israel fires at children for fun, it's not interested in aid, it kills randomly, etc., etc., etc. And today the GHF gave a briefing for foreign media where they showed that this disgruntled former employee would only threatened GHF that if he's not given his job back, he will make them pay. And when he left, he said that GHF is doing a great job and everything like that. They showed the international media the proof that this person went to the BBC because of a grudge against his former employees. And he was barely in Gaza for more than a few days anyway, and was not at the point where he claimed that he'd witnessed these atrocities. All of this was released to the media, and many of those who covered his claims themselves. Did we see any disclaimers? Did we see any walkbacks? Did we see taking down of articles? Unfortunately not. That's the reality that Israel faces every single day.
All right, many thanks, Ashley. We have unfortunately reached the end of our discussion for this week. I want to thank you again for taking the time to update us.
Thank you, absolutely.
Yes, of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please join us on Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a podcast with Ahmed Hashemi on the imperial nature of the Islamic Republic of Iran. As always, we thank you all again for your viewership and for your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.